So welcome to Mindset Tools Mastery. I'm David Phelan. And in this presentation, we're going to focus on a mindset model. And the purpose of this model is to help us to think about what's going on and to think about ways that we can increase the likelihood of getting the results that we want. And so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. Okay. So what we're looking to do with the model is to be able to manage the way that we feel and also to get the results that are most important to us. And as I've worked with clients, I found that there's two different configurations of the model and that one may be more helpful to you than the other. So I'm going to go through the first configuration and then I'll share with you the second one. So, excuse me. So when I think about why people want to work with me, it's generally for one of those two reasons. Either they don't like the way they are feeling or they don't like the way things are going, which is to say that they want a different result. Now, sometimes the feelings that they're experiencing might be fear or stress or anxiety. It could be anger. They could be feeling sad or down. Maybe they're frustrated by things that are going on. And sometimes it's that they want to be able to accomplish something more specific. They might want to have a better relationship with their spouse or their partner. They might want to find a better way to raise their children. Maybe their parenting strategies aren't working. It could be something that is related to other relationships or things outside them. So the reason that the word results is in the stop sign is that when a client comes to me, I really believe it's possible for them to get the results that they are looking for. And so I encourage them to keep going until they get those results. And even if that, as they're working on that work is not with me, whether they do that on their own or with me or even with somebody else, I encourage them to keep going because I believe they are capable of getting the results that they're identifying. The other reason the word results is in the stop sign is because it also tells us when to stop working together, right? As soon as somebody's getting the results that they want, then it doesn't make sense for us to continue, unless they identify something else that they're interested in working on. So the word results is in the stop sign because I want them to keep going and not stop until they're getting those results. Now, when you're thinking about what it is that you want, and for the purposes of this presentation, it might be helpful to think about your life and to be able to identify, is there anything in any area of your life that's not going the way that you would like it to go? It could be a relationship with somebody. I frequently work with clients who have a family member, maybe it's of the immediate family or their extended family, where there is frequent conflict. It could be something happening, like I said, at work. Maybe they're not reaching the deadlines that they want to. They're not getting the metrics that they're being expected to accomplish. It could have something to do with their spirituality. It could be something about their emotional well-being, their health. Maybe it's weight loss or exercise or something like that. So there are a lot of different areas in our life where we want to get different results. So just think about your own life for a minute and just take a moment to write down one example of a different kind of result that you would like to get. So if you're not getting the results that you want, it can feel like being in a prison cell. So I want you to imagine being in a prison cell, and I want you to think about what it would be like for you if you were stuck in that unpleasant and difficult place, and the key to the prison cell was outside the prison cell and it was beyond your reach. If you were in that situation, you'd be stuck. There wouldn't be anything that you could do about it. And sometimes when clients come to me, that's what it feels like for them, that because of the circumstances that they're in, because of the situation that they're dealing with, they feel like they're stuck. But one of the things that we explore is, what if the key, in fact, was not outside the prison cell? What if the key was inside the prison cell? Then if they're able to identify that, if they're able to find the key, then they're able to liberate themselves. And this model is about that, is about where do we place our focus so that we can get the results that we are most interested in. So in order to describe how we're going to do that, I want to talk a little bit about the nature of thought. And this is an area where we can get stuck in our approach to things if we don't understand how thoughts really work. So this painting that you can see here is by an artist who I really love and appreciate. And this painting was in my office for many years. And often I would use this as an example, and I would ask my clients, is this a lighthouse in the ocean? And oftentimes they would, agree that it's a lighthouse in the ocean. And then I would say, or is it more accurate to say that it's a painting of a lighthouse in the ocean? And they would recognize that distinction, that the painting is a representation of the object, not the object itself. So when we think about our thinking, when we think about our thoughts, it's important to create that same distinction, that our thoughts are representations of what's happening outside of us. Our thoughts are not the thing itself. So an example of that is that I have thoughts about you, but the thoughts that I have of you are not you. And that can get me into trouble sometimes if I'm thinking about what you're doing. And let's say that I disagree with what you're doing, and I can become upset by what's going on without recognizing that what's in my mind is not you, but just a representation that I have of you. Now, think about that lighthouse, and imagine the artist was painting a dog. That would be a very bad representation of a dog. But I happen to know this artist, and I know that it actually is a pretty good likeness of what she was painting, right? So sometimes our thoughts can be like that. Sometimes we have a representation that's completely inaccurate about the person or about the situation. But even if our thoughts are an accurate representation, it's still only a representation. So as we go through the rest of the presentation, I want us to keep that in mind, that our thoughts are just representations. So when we're trying to get the results that we want, there are three things that are happening inside us that determine whether or not we get those results. So the first of them is our thinking. And again, what we just talked about is that our thinking is a representation of the situation, of the person, of the object. It's not the object itself. So there's our thinking, there's our feeling, what we might also call our emotions or emotional states. And then there's also our action or our behavior, what we do. So these are the three things that are happening inside of us, our thinking, our feeling, and our behavior, that are determining how if we get the results that we're interested in or not. And so I want to give you an example of how all three of these things work together. Imagine that you were in a situation where there was a big dog that was running at you, barking, growling, salivating, looking hungry, looking mean. What would you be thinking that this dog is going to do to you? Well, you might be thinking that the dog is going to bite you. If you were thinking the dog was going to bite you, how would you feel? Again, there's a good chance that you would feel scared. And if you were feeling scared, what would you do? Well, you might run. Okay, now ask yourself if that makes sense, that the way that this lines up is that our thinking leads to our feelings lead to our behavior. Okay, now imagine that you're in the exact same situation. This big dog is running at you, barking, growling, salivating, looking hungry, looking mean, but you know this dog, and you know there is absolutely no way in the world this dog is going to bite you. You're thinking to yourself, the dog is not going to bite you. It's not going to attack you. It's not going to jump on you. It's not going to scratch you. It's not going to do anything. If you're thinking to yourself, the dog is not going to bite you, would you feel scared? No, you wouldn't feel scared. Okay. And if you're thinking the dog is not going to bite you and you're not feeling scared, would you run? No, you wouldn't run. Okay. Now, sometimes when I've suggested this to clients, they would say to them, they might say to me, well, I'd still feel a little scared. And so what I help them to think about is it true that the extent to which you feel scared is related to the possibility that you think you're going to get bitten still, right? So if you think 100% you're not going to get bitten, then you don't feel scared and you wouldn't run away. Okay, now, here's the important question. What changed, right? In the first situation, you thought the dog was going to bite you and you felt scared and you ran. In the second situation, you didn't think the dog was going to bite you. So you didn't feel scared and you didn't run. What changed was our thinking. Okay. And now the critical distinction with this is, did anything the big dog do change? No. In both situations, the dog was doing the same thing. The reason that's so important is that the big dog represents everything that happens outside of us, right? Nothing that happens outside of us directly impacts our emotional state. So the big dog is our circumstances, but the thinking, the feeling, and the behavior or action, that's what's happening inside of us. So what's the big dog? The big dog can be school, it can be our boyfriend, our girlfriend, our spouse. The big dog can be work. The big dog can be our children. The big dog can be traffic, can be any one of our triggers. It can be the economy. It can be anything. Anything that happens outside of us is the big dog, right? Now, what we tend to think is that what happens outside of us is what causes our feelings, right? That what happens outside directly impacts our feelings. But what's actually happening is that what's happening outside of us is not directly impacting the way that we feel, but it's all getting processed through the thinking first. So when somebody says something to me that I don't like, and I get upset about that, am I getting upset about their behavior, or am I getting upset about what I think about their behavior? The challenge is that we oftentimes will hear in our society things like, you hurt my feelings, or she makes me so angry, right? Those are things that we hear. But both of those statements assume that there's a direct relationship between the other person's behavior and my feelings. So let me give you an example to help you to try to create this distinction. Let's say that there was somebody who you really cared about, who called you a really foul name. How would you feel about that? You know, if you thought they were serious, you know, that might be hurtful to you. But imagine that same person was lying in a hospital bed because they had been in a terrible car accident, and they're hooked up to all sorts of tubes and wires, and you approach the bedside and you can see that they're heavily medicated. And right at the point that you get to the bedside, somebody else bumps the bed, and that loved one calls you that same foul name, right? Would you be as offended? Probably not. So it's not the word itself, but our thoughts about it that is what is driving our feelings. And again, the challenge is not just that it's our thoughts, but if we remember that our thoughts are illusions, our thoughts are representations of the situation, not the situation itself, we could even potentially misrepresent to ourselves what's going on and feel bad. But even if it's an accurate representation, it's still only a representation. The way that I'm feeling is not because of the other person's behavior, but my thinking about the behavior. Now, why is it important for us to be thinking about our thoughts and about our feelings? Because there is a connection between our thinking and our feelings and our behavior. So I'd like to try to illustrate why what's going on with our feelings is so important. So imagine playing in a basketball game, and imagine that you get hit upside the head. How would you feel about that? Well, you might be upset. Imagine getting hit upside the head 10 times in the same game. Could you imagine getting so upset that at some point you walk off the court or you swing back? Yeah. So how you're feeling drives the behavior. So imagine that it's the 10th time that you've been fouled, and the ref finally blows the whistle and says you're going to go shoot free throws. Well, if you are already across the threshold in terms of how upset you are, you might not go to the free throw line. You might swing back or walk off the court. Okay. So in that moment, what you do you go to the free throw line or not, is determined by how you're feeling. Okay, now let's imagine 10th time you've been fouled. Ref finally blows the whistle. You're not across the threshold, so you're going to go shoot free throws. Getting ready to make the free throws, you're consumed by how upset you are. How well are you going to do making free throws? Probably not well. So if we can recognize that our thinking is driving our feelings, and our feelings are driving our behavior. Our feelings are determining both what action we take as well as the quality of the action. So if we're trying to get different results, if we're not aware of our thinking, we're going to have difficulty getting different results. If we're not aware of our emotional states, we're going to have difficulty getting different results. So again, our feelings are determining both what action we take as well as the quality of the action. Okay, now, when somebody's not getting the results they want, they might decide to focus on the action so that they can get a different result. Now, that seems like a reasonable thing to do, but there can be a challenge with that. And the example that I would like to use is sort of a classic example of weight loss. So imagine that somebody gets on a scale, they look down, and they see a number that's larger than they want it to be. In that moment, they're going to feel something. They're going to feel a sense of urgency. I have to do something about this right now. Oftentimes, what happens in that moment, though, is that their thinking then shifts to their behavior. What am I going to do differently? I'm not going to eat any more sweets. I'm not going to eat any more carbohydrates. But then what happens? An hour later, they're standing in the kitchen. They're surrounded by sweets and carbohydrates. What happens to the decision they made an hour ago? It goes out the door, right? What if instead, when they were standing on the scale, looking down, seeing that number that's larger than they wanted to be, feeling that sense of urgency, instead of thinking about their behavior, they asked themselves the question, how do I maintain this sense of urgency? If it was an hour later and they were standing in the kitchen and they were surrounded by sweets and carbohydrates, but they were still feeling that sense of urgency that they have to do something about this right now, their mind would quickly figure out what to eat or not to eat with very little struggle, right? So instead, if we want to get different results, the temptation might be to think about the behavior. But if we're not in the emotional states that's going to drive that behavior, both what we do and the quality of what we do, we're unlikely to get the results that we're really looking for. Now, I want to offer you one caveat with the model that I'm suggesting to you. So I want you to think about the difference between Disneyland and Auschwitz, a Nazi concentration camp, right? Disneyland bills itself as the happiest place on earth. Okay. Now ask yourself, would it be possible to feel miserable at Disneyland? Yeah, if you thought about how much it cost you to get in, how long the lines are, how hot it is outside, how overcrowded the park is, how overpriced everything is in the stores, you could be miserable in Disneyland. Okay, now think about a Nazi concentration camp. If you're a prisoner, is that a happy place to be? No. But what's really interesting is if you read the writing that came out of Auschwitz, particularly a guy named Viktor Frankl, he was a Jewish psychiatrist that was imprisoned in the camp. And after he was released, he wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. Based on that book and his work, a whole field of psychology was developed called logotherapy or meaning therapy. And one of the things that he wrote about and talked about was the joy that prisoners experienced. Now, that doesn't seem to add up, right? But he talked about noticing that when people arrived at the camp, they made a decision about what being there meant. Again, that's a thinking kind of thing. And he said that many people decided that what it meant was their life was over. He also noticed that nobody who made that decision had that meaning survived the camp. The only ones that got through the camp were ones who had made a different decision, had a different meaning, that their life was not over. Now, clearly, even some people who had decided their life was not over may still have been executed, but the point is that nobody survived who decided their life was over. And he noticed that among those people, they had something else that was in common. And that was a reason to live that was beyond the camp. He said, for many people, it was their family. That was the important thing that was beyond the camp. He himself pictured his wife's face every single day while he was there. He didn't know that she had been executed in one of the other camps. He didn't know that both of his parents were executed in one of the other camps. So you're talking about a man who experienced significant personal loss himself, and yet still goes on to write about joy. He said for other people, it wasn't their family that was important to them, it was the work that they were involved in. That was so important to them, they were determined to get through the camp to get back to that work. For other people, it may have been a belief in God. For other people, maybe a desire to get out and tell the story of what was going on to make sure that something like that never happened again. But he said that he noticed that when people had a reason to live that was beyond the camp, they found joy while they were in the camp. And he said, it could have been something related to something small, like an extra scrap of bread or a guard who smiled at them or something that another prisoner did, but it was real joy. Now, why is that important? Well, if you can be miserable in the happiest place on earth, and you can find joy in a Nazi concentration camp, then it just confirms that idea that it's not what happens outside of us that determines our feelings. Now, having said that, however, I will also tell you it's a whole lot easier to feel happy at Disneyland than it is in Auschwitz, which is to say that although our circumstances do not dictate our feelings, they certainly support them. So on a day that things are going well, it's going to be easier to feel happy than on a day that things are not going well. But if you keep in mind that our happiness comes more from our thinking than from our circumstances, then even when things are not going well, we can still choose to be happy. One final note in this particular configuration of the model is the circle. The circle represents our body. And unlike what happens outside of us, the things that happen with our body have a direct impact on our emotional state. So think about how you might feel a half an hour to an hour after eating a large Thanksgiving type meal. Are you going to feel motivated or lethargic? Well, you're going to feel more lethargic. Or think about how you feel if you haven't gotten enough sleep, right? You're more likely to be irritable. No thinking is required, you just are more irritable. So as you're trying to get the results that you are interested in, it's important to pay attention to what's going on with your body. Sometimes I work with clients that are experiencing anxiety or depression, and they're working on the strategies, and they believe the strategies work. And I know from my experience that the strategies work, and they're still having a hard time getting results. Then we look at, what's going on with their physiology. Is there a hormone imbalance? Is there something going on with their sleep? Are there other things that are related to their physical health that might be getting in the way? I always tell my clients, we can know the right thing to do, but if our physiology, there's something going on with our physiology, we may find it difficult to get ourselves to do those things. Okay, so remember also that the changes that we get in our emotional state with our feelings are going to be fast. They're going to be fast both into and out of. The changes that we get in our emotional state through our thinking are going to take us longer to get to, but they're also going to last longer. So I want you to think about this model, think about, again, results, and what are the behaviors that get us the results, the emotional states that are driving the behavior, what's our thinking that supports that emotional state that is driving that behavior that gets us result. And I want you to think about the area of your life that you identified at the beginning of the presentation where you would like a different result. And I just want you to take a moment to think about, is there any application that you see in this model to what's going on with you? Again, I'm going to give you a moment to do that, and then we'll talk about the next configuration. I'd also like you to take a moment and think about if you have any questions about the model or ways that it might be applied. I want to make sure that any questions that you do have get answered. So write down any questions that you have. Okay, so let's talk now about the second configuration. It might help you as it has some of my other clients. And this configuration is more linear. And so the key that I ask people to keep in mind is that the problem is not the problem. So oftentimes when they come to me and they are talking either about the way they feel or they're talking about a distressing situation, what I try to help them to recognize is that if the problem is the way that we feel, or the problem is the situation, then we're going to stay stuck. We've set it up where the keys are outside the prison cell, okay? So think about challenges that people might come up for people, you know, if they said they're having a bad day. Well, for what reason might they be having a bad day? So it could be another person's behavior, you know, their coworker or the boss is doing something that they don't like, or maybe it's their spouse or their partner or their boyfriend or girlfriend. Maybe it's children that they're having difficulty with. Maybe it's other drivers on the road, or maybe it's other people that they come into regular contact with, you know, people that you might, you know, have meetings with. Maybe it's, you know, somebody that you run into at the grocery store. So it could be people, or they may say they're having a bad day because of the weather or because of the economy, or again, you know, they're not meeting their deadlines, or maybe, you know, they complain that your bed isn't comfortable, and because of that, they're not sleeping, or their work schedule, or their commute, or meetings that they have to go to, or changes in staff that they experience, or procedures, or their routine. What I'm going to suggest to you in this model is that none of these things outside of us is the problem. If the things that are happening outside of us are what's causing us to be stuck, there's nothing that we can do about it. But again, if the keys are in the prison cell with us, then it's just a matter of finding the key, and then we can liberate ourselves. And I'm suggesting the model, whether it's this first configuration that I just presented or the second one, the model is the key that allows us to liberate ourselves. So again, this is a more linear way of thinking about things. And so circumstance is in the bracket because it's the thing that's happening outside of us, right? And then that line, our thoughts are driving our feelings are driving our behavior is what is getting us the results that we want. Okay, now, as we think about this and thinking about what I said before about the big dog, the conclusion that we're coming towards is that circumstances are neutral. What do I mean by that? So does it make sense to you that two people can watch a Donald Trump speech and have a very different reaction to it. Or two people can watch a Joe Biden speech and have a very different reaction to it. If the reaction was in the speech itself, then everybody would feel the same way. But what's really happening is that we observe the speech and then we evaluate it. And we evaluate it based on our own thinking, our thinking about how the world works, our thinking about what's right or wrong. So the situation is neutral. It doesn't contain the feeling. There are no feelings until we think about it. Another example of that might be, imagine that somebody was talking behind your back and they were saying really terrible things about you. If you didn't know they were talking about behind your back, how would you feel? You would not be upset about it because you didn't know that it happened. You don't become upset about it until you turn your attention to that. You know, what are they saying? Why are they saying that? And that's what becomes upsetting. So if we recognize that it's our thinking that's, again, driving our feelings, then we're more in control. So, another example of that would be, think about, is killing bad, right? Now, many of us would say, yeah, killing is bad. Well, it's good for the lion, while at the same time being bad for the zebra, right? It's neutral until we evaluate. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't evaluate things. What I'm suggesting is that we should recognize that the feeling that we're having is based on the evaluation. And again, the evaluation is a representation of the thing, not the thing itself. And so if we are evaluating it in a way that supports the emotional states that are going to drive the behavior that gets us the results, then we can go ahead and hang on to that. But if we're evaluating it in a way that is distressing to us, or that gets in the way of the behavior that gets us the results, then we can recognize that we're at liberty to change that. So if we're not getting the desired result that we want, how do we use the model? Okay, so we can apply it again to any situation that we're feeling stuck. We're not getting the results that we want, either because the result itself or the way that we feel. And to get the desired results, what we want to do is to clarify what is the result that we actually want. So I was talking with a client earlier today, and he's in conflict in his marriage. And so I asked him to think about, rather than describing to me what's going on in the conflict, I asked him to see if he could identify what he wants, like what would an ideal marriage look like? Okay, so the first thing that we want to do is to get clear about where it is that we're going. What's the result that we're actually looking for? Okay, and in doing so, again, we're focusing on the result. Sometimes, like I might be driving and I think I know where I'm going and I'm clear enough about it to get into the neighborhood. And then I realize, yeah, I'm not sure exactly where it is. So then I might have to map it to find out exactly where we're going. Well, the same thing can happen with the results that we want. We sort of have a vague idea about what we're looking for, but if we can get more specific about the result, it really helps us to be able to line up our thinking and our feeling and our behavior to be able to get that result. So once we're clear about what the result is, then we want to align our thinking to that result. Okay, now this may seem counterintuitive again, but we're going to skip over the behavior. Go back to the example of the weight loss. Instead of focusing on the behavior, we're going to skip over that. Why? Because even if we choose the action that could get us the results that we want, if we're not in the right emotional state, we may not apply that very well. Or if we're not, if our thinking isn't aligned, we could do lots of different things and not get the results that we want. Okay, so sometimes, again, in relationship work that I do with people, I'll tell them that my job as a counselor is to keep an eye on both what's happening with the relationship as well as what's happening with the individual. And the reason that's so important is somebody can know exactly the right thing to do in a relationship, and if they're too anxious or they're too depressed, they're not going to do those things anyways. So we clarify the result, we skip over the behavior, we skip over the feelings and we focus on the thoughts. Now, why would we want to skip over the feelings? The reason is because feelings work just like a light bulb works. If I flip a switch, the light's going to go on. The light doesn't have a choice, right? And so the flipping the switch is my thinking. So if my thinking is aligned, it's going to produce the feelings that are going to empower me. And so I don't have to worry about what the feelings are if I can get my thinking aligned. So start with clarifying the result, work backwards, skipping over the behavior, over the feelings to the thinking. Okay, if our thinking is aligned with the results that we want, it's going to set us up with the empowering emotional states that help us to find the behavior that's going to get us the result that we want. If we are really committed to the result, we're going to be willing to go through all sorts of different trials in terms of what we attempt to be able to get the results that we want. If our thinking about getting the results is sort of half committed, when we try something that doesn't work, then we're more likely to give up. So from the results, again, skip over the behavior, skip over the feelings, and go to the thoughts. Okay, and so if we want to align our thinking to the results, so here are some questions that we can ask ourselves, right? One of the exercises that I do with my clients is what I call a mind up, and I ask them to think about anything that comes to mind when they're thinking about the circumstance or about the result, right? And I just ask them to keep writing, like for a period of like 5 minutes, just keep writing as many things as you can think about without editing it, without thinking about whether it's right or wrong. Just get whatever is in your mind out onto paper, okay? And then once you've done that, then take one of those thoughts and ask yourself, why am I choosing to think that? If we recognize that our thoughts are our choice, this question sets us up to recognize that I'm in control. So let's say, going back to the example of my client that's in a difficult situation with his wife, if the thought that he's thinking to himself is, I don't like it that she doesn't do the dishes, then he can ask himself, why am I choosing to think that, right? I don't have to think that. I can think about lots of different things. I don't have to frame that in that way. You know, is she doing the dishes or not doing the dishes? And by the way, again, it's just a thought that I'm having. My representation of my wife and the dishes aren't actually my wife and the dishes, just a representation. So why am I choosing to think that thought? The next question is, what is the feeling that is associated with that thought, right? If he's thinking in that particular way, the feeling might be frustration, right? Or a particular thought might lead to a feeling of hopelessness, or feelings of agitation, feelings of stress, feelings of worry. So what's the feeling that I'm experiencing that's associated with that thought? The fourth question is, does that feeling support me in getting the result that I want? So for that client, what he wants to have is a great relationship. Does the frustration support him in getting a great relationship? If it does, then he should keep it. But if it doesn't, then he can let it go. Now, sometimes as I'm working with clients, you know, they'll have a feeling like anger that might be related to being mistreated. And they recognize that that anger is protective. It helps them to not be mistreated again. And in that case, I don't want that person to let that feeling go unless they have another way of protecting themselves, right? If you can get the same results from confidence and motivation and determination that you can from anger, then it's okay to let the anger go, because again, you're going to be protected and going to get those same results. So that you're asking yourself, does the feeling support the result that I'm getting? And if it's not, what thought does align with the result? So if I want to have a great relationship, is the thought, I'm capable of having a great relationship, does that serve me? The thought, my wife and I are capable of working things out. The thought might be, every relationship has difficulties, and I'm in that period of difficulty, and this period of difficulty is not permanent. So I can ride through the difficulty to get to the better place. All those are examples of thoughts that would serve that result. Okay, so again, if we get stuck at not getting the results that we want, clarify the result, then work backwards to the thinking. And then these are some thoughts or some questions that we can ask ourselves about our thinking to bring them into alignment. Now, just because I've shared these models with you doesn't mean that I expect you to be great at them, right? And so I recognize that these things require practice. And that's one of the reasons why we've set up the practice groups that we have. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, and then we'll turn off the recording, and I'll entertain any questions that you guys have.